Hi, I'm Claudia von Bastian, and I will present findings from a literature survey that Alessandra Souza, pictured in the top right corner here, and I have conducted as part of a much larger consensus paper that our group of 23 colleagues has crafted in a collaborative effort to advance the understanding of individual differences in attentional control from theoretical, methodological, and analytical perspectives. So in our group, we agreed to use the label attentional control, but you will have certainly come across this construct or an aspect of this construct under many other names as well. Here, as a consensus, we define attentional control as the ability to maintain an operative goal and goal-relevant information in the face of distraction. And these kinds of distractions that we consider here can arise from three different sources: from the perceived environment, from self-generated information, or from habits. An example for distraction from the environment is what would happen in a flanker task, where people have to ignore the flanking stimuli when they respond to a central arrow. For self-generated information, a typical example would be when we mind wander, although we should really focus on a certain task, as can be assessed through thought probes. And finally, a well-known and prominent example for distraction from habits would be the Stroop task, where we need to suppress the predominant response to just read the word instead of naming the print color. And typically, when we think about individual differences in attentional control, we think of the three-factor structure with the three correlated yet independent factors of inhibition, shifting, and updating, or the bifactor model with Coveney F and shifting specific and updating specific variants, as introduced by Miyake, Friedman, and colleagues. A big challenge, though, that we face right now is that we have noticed over the past couple of years the tasks that are supposed to measure the same attentional control construct, and in particular inhibition, don't seem to correlate very well with each other. So our research questions for that literature survey were: how are individual differences in attentional control assessed? And what are relatively better tasks? So with better, we mean tasks that have relatively higher reliability, correlate more strongly with other tasks measuring the same construct, and load on a factor that is assumed to reflect that construct. Our inclusion criteria were studies of cognitively healthy participants that report zero-order correlations and/or factor loadings in a latent variable measurement model, from at least two independent performance-based measures that involve one of these three sources of distractions that I mentioned before, and that were published in a peer-reviewed outlet in English language. We started off with 40 studies that were included in a recent review by Carr and colleagues, and we added another 36, which yielded overall 85 comparisons. And the majority of these comparisons were studies or samples of younger adults and samples of children and adolescents. From those studies, we could extract 577 dependent measures, and reliability coefficients were reported for 59 of those 85 comparisons, which resulted in 406 reliability coefficients. We could extract correlation coefficients and factor loadings for almost all of the included samples, which gave us a really rich data set to dig into for this purpose. So getting to our first research question: how is attentional control measured in the current body of literature? About half of the 577 dependent measures assessed what we would say is inhibition, and the by far most popular task was the Stroop task, followed by the flanker go no-go and anti-saccade task. And about a quarter of measures assessed shifting in yellow here, and of those, almost all of them were variations of the classic task switching paradigm. And in green, we have the updating tasks, and most of those were keep track tasks, followed by n-back tasks. And in gray, we see that we also had some mind wandering measures, and most of those were thought probes. So what about the reliability of these measures? Here we've plotted the reliabilities for the different dependent variables of the different attentional control factors that we usually have reported in the literature. And the green symbols here are scores that reflect some form of accuracy. The Pink symbols are related to speed, and blue symbols depict scores that are derived from subtracting performance in one condition with high attentional control demands from performance in another condition with low attentional control demands. So what we can see here is a really large spread of reliability coefficients, especially for measures that assess inhibition with condition difference scores. In the past, there has been a lot of discussion around reliability issues of these condition difference scores, prominently, for example, in recent work by Hedge and colleagues. However, we see that this is not the entire story here, because we can see that for shifting measures, the condition difference scores aren't that bad, and the reliability coefficients there are largely acceptable. As we know that reliability usually increases with the number of trials, we thought that maybe we just need more trials for our attentional control paradigms. And so we looked into the relationship between reliability and the number of trials for some of the most popular tasks. And what we found was that this actually strongly depends on the specific task. So, for example, for the stop signal task, we observed even a negative correlation between the number of trials and reliability when we look at the SSRT score, which is depicted here with the purple squares. We think such a pattern could be maybe due to the SSRT being a different score, or due to people maybe getting habituated to the task when it becomes too long. But in any case, it seems that we can't just assume that more trials will automatically translate into higher reliability. So this alone won't help us. Instead, what we think might be the case is that for each paradigm, there might be a sweet spot for the number of trials where reliability is maximized while avoiding issues such as habituation. So what about the correlations between these measures? Do attentional control measures converge in the way that we would expect them to? To look into this, we plotted the correlations for these different measures, for the different attentional control factors, but also accounting for whether they would involve the same source of distraction or different sources of distraction. So for example, the flanker and the Stroop task, they would both be assumed to assess inhibitory control, but they involve different sources of distraction, as the flanker involves distraction from the environment and the Stroop involves distraction from habits. And what we can see is that across the board, correlations are higher between measures involving the same source of distraction than those correlations between different source measures. However, we can also see that correlations are relatively okay for updating and mind-wandering measures, but are consistently low for inhibitory control and shifting measures. And next we had a look into how these measures would load on their respective attentional control factors. And we can see the red dashed line here representing the median loading across all measures. And we see that the shifting, updating, and mind-wandering measures all do relatively well. But the inhibition measures, again, have relatively low loadings, especially those that involve distraction from the perceived environment. Again, an example, the most typical example is the flanker task, but also those that involve distraction from self-generated information, such as proactive interference tasks that are often used for this purpose. They don't do very well. Next, we checked the relation between correlation coefficients and the sample sizes. And what we found was that the median sample size, plotted here as the vertical dashed line, was just 159 participants, ranging from 36 to more than 1,000 people. And the median correlation, shown as the horizontal dashed line, was 0.16, with most correlations still being below 0.30. So what that means is that the median sample size is really quite far below of what we would need for such small correlations to stabilize, which would be at least around 250, probably more participants. So if we think that these correlations reflect any meaningful variance in attentional control, then we really need to use larger sample sizes to get some stable estimates. So now we talked a lot about things that do not look very good and seem a little bit bleak, but are there maybe some tasks that work better? And indeed, we found that updating anti-saccade and go-no-go tasks seem to do better in terms of showing higher reliability, higher between task correlations, and higher loadings on their respective attentional control factors. And one reason for that might be that performance in these tasks is typically assessed by single scores. So those are scores that are computed based on either all trials of that task or the trials of just one condition in that task, and not differences between performance in different conditions of that task. However, that is a point for quite a debate. So amongst our authors, we quite disagree on whether such single scores adequately reflect attentional control. So for example, for updating, when you think about accuracy across all trials, how much does that really reflect attentional control, and how much does that reflect maintenance, for example? So to sum up, our literature survey showed that attentional control is measured by really a large variety of measures, and that is true both for the variability in paradigms used as well as the many different ways how to score performance in these paradigms. So you can decide whether to use accuracy or reaction time, single or condition difference scores, and we didn't even mention all the many different ways how we can trim and transform data before we even get to the scoring. Many of the measures had really poor psychometric properties, and for those measures that did relatively better, there is little consensus over their construct validity. So at the moment, there is probably not a single attentional control measure that we would all agree upon is a good measure. And of course, this all aside, we also have to face the challenge that those low correlations between measures could actually also suggest that our theoretical conceptualization of the construct of attentional control may just not be accurate. So what do we do now? Should we now just bury our head and ignore this and carry on? No, of course not. So there's plenty of things we can do actually to tackle this challenge together. So moving forward, we think there are really lots of things actually that we can do now. First of all, it would be really good to check and just report the psychometric properties of the attentional control tasks whenever we do research on individual differences, not only on attentional control, but especially in attentional control. Second, when there is no consensus regarding scoring and analyses of particular paradigms, we could do multiverse analysis, which means that we would run the analyses in all possible ways and check how robust our conclusions are. Third, several groups have now started to develop novel approaches to assess attentional control, and that is both true for novel tasks as well for the use of different dependent variables. And of course, they need further validation and there'll be lots of discussion, but it demonstrates that we won't just bury our heads, but that we can actually move forward from this. There's now also a range of statistical and formal models that can alleviate some of these issues, and we discussed them in more detail in our consensus paper. So for example, hierarchical models can address the issue of trial noise and so help us with the reliabilities of our measures. And cognitive measurement models can make theoretical assumptions more explicit and so facilitate our discussion. We also think that transparently reporting and sharing our task materials, data, and analysis scripts can help, as it will enable others to more accurately assess our choices that we've made, and so hopefully as a field get us to incorporate practices that seem to result in progress and drop those that do not. And last but not least, we think that such a more transparent, but also collaborative and eventually cumulative approach across the community can accelerate progress in the field. And having come together as a community to write this consensus paper shows that we can actually work together on this despite our diverging and theoretical methodological views, and that makes us quite optimistic that we can figure this out and advance our understanding of individual differences in attentional control. Thank you very much for listening, and please Check out our preprint and materials if you're interested in learning more about what we discussed in this paper, and any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thanks for watching.